In the spring of 1888, a dredging crew working the lower Mississippi near Natchez pulled something from the riverbed that wasn't supposed to be there. They weren't looking for anything unusual. They were clearing silt for a new cotton barge channel, ankle deep in black mud, dragging iron rakes through clay that hadn't been disturbed in God knows how long. And then one of the rakes caught something solid. Not stone, not wood, bone, two skeletons laid side by side, arms folded across their chests in a way that suggested deliberate burial, not drowning, not accident, not random placement by current. These two had been put there, carefully, intentionally. And when the foreman, a man named Harlan Osgood, crouched down and started brushing away the sediment with his bare hands, he noticed something that made his stomach turn. Both skeletons had 6 fingers on each hand, 12 fingers per body, 24 total. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And lodged inside the orbital sockets of both skulls were fragments of a crystalline mineral that refracted light in a pale blue hue. The crew stopped working. Osgood sent word upriver to the Natchez Historical Society. And what happened next is one of the strangest, most deliberately buried chapters in American archaeology. Because these weren't just unusual remains. They were evidence of something that the academic institutions of the late 19th century didn't want to deal with. Something that didn't fit the timeline. Something that, if taken seriously, would have forced a complete re-examination of who was living along the Mississippi corridor long before European contact, long before the mound builders, long before anyone we've been taught about in school. And that's exactly why they made it disappear. To understand what happened to the Natchez twins and why it matters, you have to understand what was going on in American archaeology in 1888. Because the discovery didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened during the single most politically charged decade in the history of American science. The Smithsonian Institution had been operating for just over 40 years by that point. And in 1882, Congress had authorized the creation of the Bureau of Ethnology under the Smithsonian's umbrella, specifically tasked with cataloging and interpreting the mound sites scattered across the Mississippi and Ohio river valleys. This was a massive undertaking. Thousands of earthworks, some of them enormous, stretching from Wisconsin to Louisiana. Geometric enclosures, effigy mounds shaped like serpents and birds, flat-topped pyramids rivaling anything in Mesoamerica. And the central question driving the Bureau's work was deceptively simple. Who built them? The popular theory at the time, and the one most Americans believed, was that a separate, now vanished civilization had constructed the mounds. They called them the Mound Builders, capital M, capital B, a lost race, possibly of European or Near Eastern origin, possibly connected to the lost tribes of Israel, possibly something else entirely, but definitely not the indigenous peoples who were living on or near the mounds when Europeans arrived. This theory wasn't fringe, it was mainstream. Politicians cited it, newspapers printed it, land speculators used it to justify displacement of native communities, arguing that indigenous peoples were merely squatters on someone else's infrastructure. The mound builder myth was politically useful in a way that few academic theories have ever been, and that usefulness made it almost impossible to challenge. But in 1894, Cyrus Thomas, working under the Bureau of Ethnology, published a report that was supposed to put the question to rest. His conclusion was definitive. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the same indigenous peoples who were living in the region at the time of European contact. There was no lost race, no vanished civilization, no mystery, and with that the door slammed shut. Now here's where the Natchez twins become important, because the discovery in 1888 predates Thomas's report by 6 years, and the physical characteristics of the remains, the polydactyly, the mineral deposits in the eye sockets, the positioning of the burial, and most critically the geological layer in which they were found, None of it fit neatly into either camp. Not the mound builder romantics, not the Thomas school of indigenous continuity. These remains were something else, and the people who examined them knew it. Harlan Osgood's letter to the Natchez Historical Society was received on April 14, 1888. A response came within a week, which was fast for their era. A surveyor named Clement Duchamp was dispatched to examine the site. Duchamp wasn't an archaeologist. He was a civil engineer with an interest in geology, which turned out to be more useful than any archaeological training would have been, because Duchamp's first observation had nothing to do with the skeletons themselves. It was about where they were found. The burial layer sat beneath approximately 9 feet of alluvial sediment, and based on the rate of sedimentation along that stretch of the Mississippi, Duchamp estimated that the remains had been deposited or buried at a time when the river's course was significantly different from its 1888 path. He put the burial date at a minimum of 2,000 years prior, possibly older, possibly much older. That alone was noteworthy. But the real problem, the thing that made Duchamp's report so uncomfortable for the institutions that eventually received it, was the condition of the bones themselves. The skeletons were remarkably well preserved, far better than most remains of comparable age found in similar environments. The bones showed no signs of disease. The dental structure was complete, with no evidence of decay or wear consistent with a grain-heavy diet, which was unusual for any population in the Mississippi corridor after the adoption of maize agriculture. And then there were the hands. Polydactyly, the presence of extra fingers or toes, isn't unheard of. It occurs in roughly 1 in every 500 live births today. But bilateral polydactyly, 6 fingers on both hands, is far rarer, and for 2 individuals buried side by side to both exhibit the same trait suggests one of 2 things. Either they were closely related, twins or siblings from a lineage where polydactyly was a dominant genetic trait, or they came from a population where this characteristic was common enough to appear in multiple individuals simultaneously. The second possibility is the one that keeps people up at night, because if polydactyly was a population-level trait rather than an individual anomaly, it implies a genetically distinct group. A group that was either isolated long enough for the trait to become fixed in their gene pool, or a group that was fundamentally different from the surrounding populations to begin with. Duchamp noted all of this in his report. He also noted the crystalline deposits in the eye sockets, which he couldn't identify with the tools available to him. He described them as resembling pale blue quartz, but with an internal luminescence he'd never encountered in any mineral sample. He sealed several fragments in wax paper and sent them to the Smithsonian along with his written assessment. The Smithsonian acknowledged receipt of the mineral samples in a letter dated June 1888. They never published a single word about them. Duchamp's report was filed. The mineral samples disappeared into the collections, and that was the end of the official record. But it wasn't the end of the story, because Duchamp kept copies, and he kept talking. Throughout the 1890s, Duchamp corresponded with several independent researchers who were investigating anomalous finds along the Mississippi and Ohio River corridors. These weren't cranks. They were surveyors, geologists, and amateur naturalists who kept encountering things that didn't fit the emerging orthodoxy. Giant skeletal remains, copper artifacts with metallurgical properties that seemed too advanced for the supposed technology of the time, stone structures buried under sediment layers that predated any known occupation. And the consistent pattern wasn't just the anomalies themselves, it was what happened after they were reported. Finds were collected, catalogued, and then quietly shelved. Reports were filed but never published. Researchers who pushed too hard were marginalized. The message was clear. The narrative had been decided. Anything that contradicted it was a distraction. Duchamp's correspondence with a geologist named Everett Stilwell in St. Louis is particularly revealing. Stilwell had been studying the sediment layers along the Mississippi between Memphis and Vicksburg, and he'd noticed something peculiar. At several points along the river there were discontinuities in the sediment record, layers that didn't match the expected pattern of gradual deposition. Instead, they showed evidence of sudden catastrophic events, massive floods, possible seismic disruption. And in at least 3 locations, Stilwell found evidence of human modification of the landscape that predated the discontinuity. In plain language, someone had been engineering the riverbank before the catastrophic event buried their work. Stilwell's findings were never peer-reviewed because he could never get anyone to review them. He submitted papers to 3 separate journals between 1893 and 1898. 2 rejected him without explanation. The 3rd accepted conditionally, then withdrew the acceptance after what Stilwell described in a letter to Duchamp as pressure from institutional quarters I cannot identify. He presented his data at a regional geological conference in 1896 and was politely ignored. The moderator cut his presentation short by 12 minutes, citing scheduling concerns. Nobody asked a single question afterward. Stilwell died in 1903, and his papers were donated to the Missouri Historical Society, where they sat in storage for over a century. His widow, Eleanor, wrote to the society twice requesting that his sediment studies be forwarded to the Geological Survey Office in Washington. Both letters went unanswered. Now, here's where this starts connecting to something bigger. The Mississippi River corridor wasn't just a waterway. It was, and in many ways still is, the economic spine of the North American continent. Everything flows through it: grain, timber, cotton, petroleum, chemicals, manufactured goods. Control of the Mississippi has been the single most important strategic and economic priority in American history, from the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 to the Army Corps of Engineers' ongoing battle to keep the river from changing course today. And the infrastructure along the river, the levees, the locks, the channelization projects, is staggeringly complex. Modern engineers have spent billions trying to manage a system that, by their own admission, they don't fully understand. The Mississippi does things that models can't predict. It shifts. It floods in patterns that don't match historical records. It erodes banks that should be stable and leaves intact structures that should have been destroyed decades ago. What if the reason our models don't work is that we're working on top of someone else's infrastructure? That's not as wild a suggestion as it sounds. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Army Corps of Engineers documented numerous instances of encountering unexpected subsurface structures during levee construction and channel work. Stone formations, compacted earthworks, arrangements of material that didn't match any known natural process. In 1927, during the Great Mississippi Flood, the worst river disaster in American history, repair crews working near Greenville reported breaking through a layer of what they described as fitted stone approximately 14 feet below the modern surface. The stones were rectangular, roughly uniform in size, and showed tool marks. The crew foreman filed a report. The report was acknowledged. No follow-up investigation was conducted. The stones were removed and dumped as fill material for a temporary levee. Most of these encounters were noted in engineering logs and then ignored because the Corps wasn't in the business of archaeology. They were in the business of controlling the river. If they hit something strange, they built over it or around it and moved on. But some of those engineering logs survived. And when you read them alongside Duchamp's notes and Stilwell's sediment studies, a pattern starts to emerge. A pattern of deliberate landscape modification along the Mississippi that predates anything in the accepted historical record. Not by decades, by millennia. The twin skeletons with their 12 fingers weren't just a curiosity. They were evidence of the people who did the modifying. Let's talk about the eyes. The crystalline deposits that Duchamp found in the orbital sockets of both skulls were never formally analysed during his lifetime. But in 2011, a researcher named Margaret Holloway, working at a private lab in Baton Rouge, obtained permission to examine a collection of unclassified mineral samples at the Louisiana State Museum that had been donated from various 19th century estate sales. Among the samples was a small wax paper envelope labelled Natchez River Recovery, 1888, see Duchamp. Holloway ran X-ray diffraction analysis on the fragments and cross-referenced the results against standard geological databases. The results didn't match any standard mineral classification. The crystalline structure was silicon-based, similar to quartz, but with trace elements of copper and barium arranged in a lattice pattern that Holloway described as highly ordered, suggesting either extreme natural conditions or intentional synthesis. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Intentional synthesis. In other words, somebody made these. The implication is extraordinary. If the crystalline material was manufactured, then it represents a level of material science that we don't associate with any known pre-Columbian population in North America. And if it was placed deliberately in the eye sockets of the deceased, it suggests a burial practice with technological sophistication that has no parallel in the archaeological record of the Mississippi corridor. Holloway published her findings in a minor geological journal. The paper received almost no attention. She presented it at a conference the following year and was met with polite skepticism. The standard response was that the samples had likely been contaminated or mislabeled during their century plus in storage. Without provenance documentation, they argued, the findings were meaningless. But Holloway had Duchamp's original letter. She had the wax envelope with his handwriting, and she had X-ray results that showed a material that doesn't occur naturally anywhere on Earth in that specific configuration. She couldn't explain it, and neither could her critics, so they did what institutions have always done with uncomfortable evidence. They ignored it. Let's pull back and look at the economic dimension of all this, because that's where the Tartareus question becomes more than just alternative history. It becomes a question about power. The standard narrative of American economic development goes like this. Europeans arrived on a largely undeveloped continent. They built infrastructure from scratch. Railroads, canals, levees, bridges, roads, ports. The wealth of the nation was created through the application of European technology and capital to a virgin landscape. But what if the landscape wasn't virgin? What if the infrastructure that made American economic dominance possible was, in part, built on top of foundations that were already there? What if the reason the Mississippi corridor became the economic heart of the continent wasn't just geography and luck, but because someone, long before anyone we know about, had already engineered it for exactly that purpose? Consider the mounds themselves. The largest, Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, covered 6 square miles. It had a population that may have exceeded 20,000 at its peak around 1100 AD. It was the largest city in North America until Philadelphia surpassed it in the 1780s, and it was situated at the exact confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, the most strategically significant inland waterway junction on the continent. That's not coincidence, that's planning. But the orthodox view is that Cahokia simply emerged from local agricultural developments, that the Mississippian culture that built it was an indigenous evolution, impressive but ultimately limited, that it declined due to environmental degradation and social instability, and that by the time Europeans arrived it was already abandoned. What gets left out of that narrative is the sheer scale of engineering involved. The central mound at Cahokia, Monk's Mound, contains roughly 22 million cubic feet of earth. It was constructed in stages over several centuries, with each layer carefully compacted and oriented. The base covers 14 acres. The engineering required to build it, the labour organisation, the material transport, the geometric precision, rivals anything in contemporary Europe. And Cahokia wasn't alone. There were thousands of mound sites along the Mississippi and its tributaries. Some were simple burial mounds. Others were complex ceremonial centres with astronomical alignments. Still others appear to have served economic functions. acting as trade hubs or administrative centers for a network that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. A network, not isolated settlements, a network connected by waterways, managed by a coordinated authority, facilitating trade in copper, shell, obsidian, mica, and other materials across thousands of miles. That sounds like an economy. A sophisticated one. One that didn't just happen accidentally. And the twin brothers in the mud, they might be evidence of the people who ran it. Here's what we know. Polydactyly as a population-level trait has been documented in exactly one well-studied context in the Americas. The ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest, particularly at Chaco Canyon, showed elevated rates of polydactyly that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of an elite lineage. People with extra digits may have been considered special, possibly chosen for leadership or ceremonial roles. If a similar pattern existed along the Mississippi, if polydactyly was a marker of an elite or priestly class within the mound-building civilization, then the Natchez twins represent something remarkable. They're physical evidence of a ruling class, a genetic aristocracy, people who were literally built differently from the general population, and they were buried with manufactured crystalline implants in their eye sockets, technology that we can't replicate today without industrial equipment. Think about what that means for the economic history of the continent. If the Mississippi Corridor was managed by a technologically sophisticated civilization with a hereditary ruling class, then the infrastructure they built didn't just disappear when they did. It was absorbed, built over, incorporated into the very landscape that European settlers claimed as empty wilderness. The levees that the Army Corps of Engineers has been maintaining since the 19th century, some of them sit on top of older earthworks. The channel of the river itself, in several stretches, follows paths that appear to have been artificially modified long before any documented engineering project. The natural landscape of the lower Mississippi is in many places anything but natural. It's engineered terrain that's been mistaken for geology because nobody bothered to look closely enough, or because someone decided it was better not to look. Duchamp died in 1912. His papers were split between his family and the Natchez Historical Society. Most of the family copies were lost in a house fire in 1938. The society copies survived but weren't catalogued until the 1970s, when a graduate student named Patricia Emmons came across them while researching something unrelated. Emmons was studying 19th century cotton transportation infrastructure along the lower Mississippi. She wasn't looking for anomalous skeletal remains or mysterious mineral samples, but Duchamp's papers were filed in the same collection as shipping manifests and engineering surveys, and she happened to read them. She was struck by the level of detail in Duchamp's observations and by the complete absence of any institutional follow-up. Here was a well-documented, multi-witness discovery of anomalous human remains with physical characteristics that didn't match any known population, found in a geological context that suggested extreme antiquity, reported to the Smithsonian and accompanied by physical samples, and then nothing. No investigation, no publication, no acknowledgement. Emmons included a brief mention of the Natchez twins in a footnote to her dissertation. It was the first time the discovery had appeared in any academic publication in nearly 90 years. And that footnote is the only reason we know about it today, because it caught the attention of Margaret Holloway, who was doing her own research on anomalous mineral deposits in the lower Mississippi region, which eventually led her to the Duchamp samples at the Louisiana State Museum. The chain of evidence is thin, frustratingly thin, but it's there. Osgood's crew found the remains. Duchamp examined and documented them. He sent samples to the Smithsonian. Holloway found the samples and analyzed them. The results are real and reproducible. The crystalline material exists. Its composition is anomalous, and its provenance, while imperfect, traces back to a specific discovery at a specific location on a specific date. What's missing is everything that should have happened in between. The investigation, the excavation, the peer review, the publication, the integration into the broader understanding of who lived along the Mississippi and what they were capable of. That absence isn't accidental, it's a pattern, and once you start seeing the pattern, you can't unsee it. In 1882, a farmer near Sauk County, Wisconsin, uncovered a series of copper implements buried beneath a mound. The implements showed evidence of cold hammering techniques that produced a level of hardness and edge retention that modern metallurgists have struggled to replicate. The Smithsonian collected the artifacts. They were never displayed. In 1897, a crew digging a well near Chillicothe, Ohio, broke through a layer of compacted clay and found a stone chamber containing ceramic vessels with geometric patterns that didn't match any known Hopewell or Adena typology. The chamber was documented by a local physician. The artifacts were sent to the Ohio State Museum. They were catalogued as unclassified and placed in storage. In 1909, the Arizona Gazette published a story about a cave system in the Grand Canyon containing artifacts of Egyptian or Tibetan origin, allegedly discovered by a Smithsonian-affiliated explorer named G.E.E. Kincaid. The Smithsonian denied any knowledge of the expedition or the explorer. The cave has never been relocated. Each incident taken in isolation can be dismissed. Contamination, misidentification, hoax, journalistic fabrication. But taken together across decades, across multiple states, involving multiple independent witnesses and multiple institutional responses that follow the same pattern of collection followed by silence, it starts looking less like a series of honest mistakes and more like a policy of managing what the public is allowed to know about the deep history of this continent. And the Natchez twins sit right in the middle of it. Two bodies with impossible hands and impossible eyes, pulled from impossible depths, documented by a credible witness, reported through proper channels, and then erased from the record as efficiently as if they'd never existed. The Mississippi keeps moving. It always has. Every year, the Army Corps spends billions trying to keep it in its current channel, fighting against the river's natural tendency to shift westward toward the Atchafalaya Basin. If the Corps ever lost that fight, and several engineers have admitted privately that it's a fight they're slowly losing, the economic consequences would be catastrophic. New Orleans would lose its port. The entire petrochemical corridor between Baton Rouge and the Gulf would be stranded. The agricultural heartland would lose its primary export route. The infrastructure preventing that catastrophe is massive. Old river control structure, Morganza floodway, Bonnet Carré spillway, billions of dollars in concrete and steel maintained around the clock, year after year. And underneath all of it, in the mud, in the sediment layers that nobody has time to examine because there's always another flood season coming, there might be evidence of people who faced the same problem thousands of years ago. People who engineered this landscape before anyone we know about. People who might have solved problems we're still struggling with. People with 12 fingers and pale blue eyes, buried carefully in the riverbed with crystals that shouldn't exist pressed into their skulls. We don't know who they were. We might never know. The evidence has been scattered, suppressed, lost, and ignored for over a century. But the mud remembers, the river remembers, and every time someone digs deep enough, they find things that don't fit the story we've been told. The question isn't whether the Natchez twins were real. Duchamp's documentation is too detailed, too specific, too corroborated by the mineral evidence for that to be in serious doubt. The real question is why nobody wanted to find out what they meant. And maybe that question is its own answer. Because if you're running an economy built on the premise that this continent was empty before you got here, the last thing you want is evidence that someone was here first. Someone who engineered the rivers, someone who built the mounds, someone who had technology you can't explain. The twins in the mud weren't just a scientific curiosity. They were a threat to a narrative that justified an entire economic order. And threats to economic order don't get investigated. They get buried, just like the twins themselves, twice buried, once by whoever loved them enough to lay them side by side with crystal in their eyes, and once by the institutions that decided the world wasn't ready to know they existed. The Mississippi rolls on, the mud settles, And somewhere beneath 9 feet of alluvial clay near Natchez, there might be more. More bodies, more crystals, more evidence of a civilization that built this landscape before history began recording. Duchamp understood this. In his final letter to Stilwell, written in 1901, 2 years before Stilwell's death and 11 before his own, he wrote something that still resonates. "The river gives up its secrets reluctantly," he said, "but it gives them up. The question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is whether the men who find it will have the courage to say what it means. I did not have that courage. Perhaps someone who comes after will." 138 years later, we're still waiting for that someone. The evidence sits in museum drawers. The engineering logs sit in government archives. The sediment layers sit beneath the levees and the barges and the petrochemical plants. All we'd have to do is look. But looking has always been the one thing we're not allowed to do.